Okay, let's go for it. All right, good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi.
Go on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's panel on the EU's space traffic management policy and a discussion with a selection of panelists from the European institutions and industry. As you'll know, space traffic management is an increasingly important area in the space policy debate, and the European Commission has announced the work on an EU space law, which will include a focus on space sustainability. The recent Council conclusions on the fair and sustainable use of space have further ignited the debate and added overall work to these ongoing plans. We understand that the European Commission is hard at work drafting the EU space law, and we want to take this occasion before the summer holidays to delve into this subject a little bit further, hear from them on what the next steps are, where the impact assessment is, what member states may want, as well as from the Parliament on what their wishes are, while also making sure to tune in to Airbus and Okapi Orbits, two companies in the European space sector working on the subject, and hear a little bit on what industry may want on the subject as well. The key issues in the upcoming EU space law, as noted by Commissioner Breton, are common rules on collision avoidance, safety and mitigation measures, threats assessments, resilient requirements, and a zero debris approach in line with the UN principles on space sustainability as well. And we want to talk about these things today. For a little bit more information, at Access Partnership, we follow this subject very closely and help companies and governments ensure that they are aligned on these policy goals. I'm a member of the Space and Spectrum Policy Practice, and my colleague Alexander will be moderating today. If you have any questions on these policies or topics, please feel free to reach out to us through our website or over our social medias. And I will hand now over to Alexander, who will lead the panel and introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introductory remarks. As my colleague noted, my name is Alexander. I'm part of the Access Partnerships Brussels team, working on Europe affairs, very much closely on space policy as well. It's my honor to be a part of today's debate and moderate it on a very, very important topic, one that has been on the minds of all of us here in Brussels, and not only in Brussels for the past, I would say, year now. I'm joined today by some of our distinguished guests. Cristina Nicolaus, the co-founder and CEO of Okapi Orbits, Mr. Bertrand de Courdan, from the head of EU and NATO Public Affairs, Defense and Space at Airbus. And we will also be joined by Christoph Kautz, head of Unit for Secure Connectivity, Space Surveillance and Applications in DG DEFI, European Commission, as well as by Mr. Nicolas Minas, member of the European Parliament. They will soon join us, some technical issues on all of our ends, so hopefully we will have everyone on tune very, very shortly. I think we can go ahead and start the debate because the issue is of utmost importance. So, Mr. Courdan, if I could maybe start with you. Airbus has been one of the largest players in the ecosystem for quite some time, a foundational member of the ecosystem. I wanted to ask, what is Airbus's approach to space traffic management, space sustainability now, and what are the plans going forward?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar on what I should call a hot topic, space traffic management. I will make 4 points to introduce our exchanges. And I very much welcome the opportunity to have also on board the European Commission and the European Parliament, which will be key institutional players in the next steps of this challenge. First point, the space traffic management is a key enabler for space sustainability. And we, as Airbus, as a leading company in space activities, we are, of course, very much supporting the concept of space sustainability, but this is most probably the case also for our partners and competing companies. I'm sure that Cristina will endorse this position as well. Why is it key for us? It is key because this is critical for the protection of our assets, because as Airbus, we own a number of space items in space and on the ground, which are potentially threatened by space activity. And it's also, of course, of utmost importance for the future of our business. And therefore, we are very much interested in putting in place a frame which will protect the future development and activities in this domain. My second point is that at the moment there are many, at least on the EU scene, there are many declarations and forums organized around this topic of space traffic management. But we strongly believe that now the time has come for action, and there is an urgent need to put in place the frame which is needed for space traffic management, with the multiplication of satellites into orbits, especially in the low orbital positions. Action in our mind means two things. First of all, investment, and secondly, regulation. Both are linked, but I think we have to address both of them. My third point is that the investment, for the investment part of the response, it's important to have a close dialogue and coordination between the military or the defense and the commercial users, because the issue, the matter of traffic management in space is a challenge both for military and civil users. So this is important to have a complementary approach from both sides. And it's also to say that the means to develop space traffic management are by essence dual use. We as Airbus are developing dual use technologies and tools which are intended to contribute to space traffic management. For instance, we are providing the treatment of space surveillance data. So how to evaluate the situation based on the data collected on the space situation awareness. We are also providing space surveillance and tracking services, so providing answers or suggestions on how to improve the management of the traffic. And we are also developing on a more hardware side sensors, laser communication system, which might help to put in place the right tools to manage the space traffic. And another example of this dual use approach is also that, for instance, we clearly intend to apply to two European Defence Funds calls, which are now taking place and which are both addressing space threats and space surveillance awareness. And there we are clearly intending to propose solutions in a consortium answering the EDF, the European Defence Fund calls. And my fourth point, sorry, the last one, regards regulation. And this is where we as industry, and I think I can speak in the name of all industry on that side, we need a clear, stable, and an harmonized legal framework to operate and develop our space systems. And this is where, of course, the intended EU space law is very much welcome. We need the same rules established to create a kind of level playing field in the market. So to have all the players addressed by the same or under the same framework, and I think this is one of the aim of this EU space law. So we very much support this idea. For the Commission, I think it means more internal market, which is another way to express the same thing. And the second element we expect from the EU space law, and which is also important for us, is to have the right balance of constraints on our activities to make them more secure, more controlled, but at the same not to add too much constraints which would make our activities too costly or which would destroy or at least decrease our level of competitivity. So there is a challenge the Commission and maybe also for the Parliament to find the right way to address this regulation of space traffic, to create security at that level, but at the same to allow industry to remain competitive and to have the means still achievable in terms of funding. Voilà, these are the 4 points I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the important contribution, and definitely echoing what you said regarding harmonization and making sure that there's a legal framework in place. Mr. Cao, it's great to have you back again. If I can maybe ask you, if that's fine, so we heard from Mr. De Courdeau regarding the first kind of industry view. If I could ask you to provide an update on what the European Commission has been doing. We've heard that there's been an ongoing impact assessment. So whether you could share any progress on drafting the EU space law, specifically regarding the space traffic management portions.
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, apologies that I'm joining a little bit later, but I had a slight IT problem. So on the space law on which we are working, perhaps to say a few words why we are working on 3 elements, which is safety, security, and sustainability, and then I will say a little bit where we are at with the process. So first of all, with regard to security, we have seen that the massively changing geopolitical context with increasing level of security threats against space infrastructures, and I think the Ukraine war was a very visible proof of that. And this security pillar of what we are working on, we have laid out some ideas in the strategy on space security and defense. Then we have a second pillar, which is on safety. So we have this rapid expansion of space activities with a lot of new commercial actors, which is leading to increasing congestion and potential risk of collision. And this part, this safety part, we have said a few words on legislative initiatives in our EU STM approach that we published a little bit more than a year ago. And then thirdly, with regard to sustainability, I think whilst the direct impact of EU environmental policy on the space sector may vary, I think the EU's commitment to sustainability and environmental protection influences also the broader context in which space activities operate. So the space sector is also expected to align with the EU's environmental goals. And to facilitate that, in a certain sense, we have this third pillar, which is on sustainability. And then, apart from these 3 pillars, there is, of course, let's say, 2 overarching elements, and which, in particular, the first one has an impact on the way we will be drafting this space law, is the risk of internal market fragmentation. So we have today 11 member states that have national space laws, each one having their own approach to safety, security, resilience, sustainability. But in our view, there is really a risk of fragmentation of the internal market, also knowing that apart from these 11 member states, there are a few more who are working on space laws. And we think a common set of rules would enhance the competitiveness of the industry. And then there's, of course, another horizontal element, which is the risk of external influence, or rather, how much do we want to lead and how much will we be led by others. And also, if we don't have a unified EU position, it will be difficult to steer relevant discussions in international fora. So here also we think that if we don't have a position, this could have a negative impact on competitiveness. Now, we have these 3 pillars that we have in mind. And when I say that we have these in mind, means that, of course, as you said, we need to do an impact assessment. Now, in terms of impact assessment, it will not be different from other impact assessments that the Commission does. So there will be a public consultation phase, and then we will do an impact assessment report, and we'll go through the regulatory scrutiny board, etc., etc. At this moment, we are working on we're quite advanced on the public consultation that we want to issue. I cannot give you here today a date when this will happen. This is under discussion, but let's say we are quite advanced in terms of the public consultation we want to launch. And of course, and it's also not a state secret, we also have, of course, always some people who help us in writing these or providing input to this impact assessment. So also here we have some people who are helping us or who will help us in writing this impact assessment. And of course, final element, we are also discussing with relevant services in the Commission. I mean, not least the legal service on that. Voila.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that update. I'm sure we're all looking forward very much to the public consultation. Thank you for now. And then if I can turn to Christina, you are the CEO of Okapi Orbits and the co-founder of Okapi Orbits. As I know, your motto is making new space safer. So a very important task, objective, which we are all looking forward to hoping you achieve. So if you could give us a few words on what are you doing in the space sustainability, space traffic management sector, and especially how you're bridging software and space together. That would be very, thank you.
Sure. So hi from my side as well. We're at Okapi Orbits. We developed a space traffic management. We started off in 2018 with a service portfolio dedicated for spacecraft operators, so many satellite operators, serving them a whole service toolkit from pre-launch to basically the orbiting. This includes, for example, mission analysis. So we try to make sure how is the optimal setup to look like for a spacecraft to have a minimal impact on the space environment, and also what is the optimal layout. Then we go forward to the collision avoidance services. Here we use an AI-powered prediction tool that we fuse data sets from radars, telescope, and laser ranging stations to really create a holistic overview what's going on, what are the neighbors of our satellites and the space debris of our satellites are doing. And then moving forward in planning, how is the satellite re-entering? What is the deorbiting strategy? How can we use the propulsion systems in a correct manner to have a minimal impact on the industry? And the goal with all this, what we're doing is to really minimize maneuvers for satellite operators and also make sure there's a minimal impact or no impact in creating additional space debris. And this is what we're offering right now. We have a bunch of constellations, mainly European ones so far, who are using the software services. And we're extending the portfolio as we're a growing company and a classical new space company, you would say, also to make sure the operators are compliant with guidelines. I think it's good that Christoph mentioned the 11 nations having space laws. We make sure that satellite operators really meet the guidelines they have to meet. And also we're looking more towards the direction of we have more active satellites, not only in LEO, but in all orbital regimes, to make sure they maneuver and consider the maneuvers of their neighbors to really coordinate how we act in space. And yeah, that's where we're acting as Okapi.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Very interesting about what Okapi is doing and hopefully going forward, all the successes. I wanted to turn to the last, but definitely not least. Niklas, I don't know whether you can turn on your camera. We don't see you, unfortunately. I see. Can you maybe hear us? I think you may be on. Okay. Perfect.
Yes, I thought my camera is on the time, so I don't know.
We're having the whole day with IT failures, so we couldn't see you, unfortunately, but we see you perfectly now. So thank you so much. As I said, last but not least, I wanted to ask about the Parliament's views on this important or upcoming and very important still approach in the EU space laws, particularly what would you like to see in the upcoming approach and what you think is needed to make sure space remains or is safe?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy that we have so much interest in this topic and so much good and great proposals in this direction. So Parliament has already in a resolution called for an STM proposal, and we have also introduced the sustainability criteria into IRIS. This all brings us to the point where I think the Commission made the right move to say, you know, let's tackle all of this together in a space law. And I think if we are addressing a space law, then this should also even extend on these regards. We've heard from Mr. Cordeux that there's an interest in harmonization for industry. It has been mentioned that there's a divergence in the different member states depending on their status at the moment. And of course, we must not forget that there's a lot of companies who will work in future together when it comes to space endeavors, but will work across borders, across European borders. And for them also, of course, it's much easier if they have the same regulatory framework on Earth as well as outside of Earth. And so I think we should dare to go as far as possible and give ourselves the chance to set a groundwork, internationally speaking, not just in the questions of sustainability and security, but also in the questions of industry standards, etc. So I'm really hoping for a regulation that will limit the amount of space debris that we produce in space, meaning calling for return to Earth to bring your own trash home, basically. Then I'm hoping also that we look into the technology needed when it comes to space traffic management, but also the reduction of space. I think this is still a very difficult question, something that we cannot just solve solemnly with regulatory frameworks, but where we need to see how to solve this problem technologically speaking. But then also in this regard comes up the question, who is going to pay for this? And I think this will be a very dedicated discussion also that we'll have in the future when it comes to the removal of space. But let's make it also clear, I think it is much needed that we approach this at the moment, because if we want to see more investments into the orbits, basically manifesting themselves in form of celestial, man-made celestial bodies in orbits, then these are valuable and they should be protected. And I think there's nothing more annoying than knowing that there's a little bolt that could at any time destroy your million to billion euro strong investment that you just made in order to provide services for, well, the European people, but also the people of the world in general. And so I think we need to solve this issue to reduce the amount of space debris. We need to really clean up our backyard to make sure that safety comes first for any future investment that we want to put there, and then allow for the market and the industry to grow excessively and be a good example, European-wide, for the international standards, so that we can have this one-step advantage over other regions. And I really hope that the Commission will also go in this direction. I'm interested to see what the impact assessment will bring in this regard, and whether we will have the chance for Europe to become first movers in this regard and really set international standards.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And indeed, we're all looking forward to the impact assessment as well. Hopefully, we'll see that soon. I think I first wanted to ask a question to all of the distinguished panelists here, very open and I think some of them have, some of the questions on this have already been answered. Primarily, what are the key challenges to address in the coming space law, and how do we overcome them? We heard a lot about fragmentation. We heard a bit about funding and the technological advancements. So I just wanted to ask each panelist to maybe do a short answer on what they think are the key challenges and how and if we can overcome them. Christoph, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you. So in my view, one of the key challenges is to do a piece of legislation which fosters, of course, the industry somehow. And what I mean by that is we have to avoid that we put European industry in a disadvantage with regard to industries of other countries that might not have a space law. So one of the things we are looking at is that such a law would also apply to owners of satellites which are not EU satellites or satellites from companies that are EU, but that those who provide services in the EU, they would also fall under this piece of legislation.
Perfect, thank you so much. Bertrand, may I ask you the same question? You mentioned fragmentation, you mentioned also funding. Anything else?
Thank you. Well, I would insist, I think on the regulatory part, there is a kind of consensus. Now, of course, the work is in the hands of the Commission and we very much wait for its proposal. We will try to contribute as much as possible. But I would rather put the light on the investment dimension I try to introduce in my introductory statement. I think it's important, of course, to be able to cope with this system challenge, to pool resources, and therefore I think it would be more than welcome if at some point the EU, namely the Commission, could consider to propose within maybe the overall EU space program an activity specifically dedicated to STM. We were glad to see in the space strategy for security and defense that there was this idea of at least launch a kind of prototype for an SSA test case. So this means to test a little bit how industry could be pushed to collaborate to propose solutions. So I think this will be of utmost importance and to be considered maybe after the EU space law will be enshrined. And also there is another topic in this investment pillar which is of importance, which is the sharing of the information, the sharing of the data. And because all the STM story starts with the management of the information. What is the picture regarding the situation in space? What are the information on the different objects and satellites which are circulating and so on. And everyone, every stakeholders, whether it's industry, whether it's Minister of Defense, whether it's EU institution, has a share of this information. But I think definitely it would be important to produce a process or mechanism which would enforce the sharing of this information to allow to provide a common response.
Perfect, thank you so much for that. Christina, Okapi Orbits is one of the newest or newer actors in the ecosystem. May I ask from your perspective, seeing how the ecosystem works now and how cooperation between industry and policymakers work, what are the key challenges in your perspective?
I think when we come to the key challenges, especially in the topic of space traffic management, we see a huge issue when it comes to data sharing. We see, I think, as mentioned before, we have we're facing really unstable geopolitical situation. We see increasing national security regulations coming to place, and even we face a lot of operators are sharing a minimal data set or are kind of reluctant to share data. But this is a crucial point to really make sure we don't have more collisions, which of course will have a big spike in the creation of space debris. And I think that's a really crucial topic when we talk about space traffic management. And I think one of the points to overcome this is if we create on an international level common sense or a code of conduct for operators on how do we want to, how do you have to act to be sustainable. This, for example, can include a 5-year deorbiting regulation, for example, or making sure that everyone uses some tools or implement something into their routines, which makes sure they don't create any space debris. Because in the end, I think cleaning up or active debris removal is a super important part, but now we have to act and take also, in my opinion, a European leadership role in showing, okay, this is how we want to be and how we want to guide away from the national consensus. And I think one last point to this, it's from my point of view, really, really important that we advertise our code of conduct internationally, because in the end, space traffic management is a highly international topic. And as European Union alone, we will not have an effect. And of course, this is a minimal step we have to do when we're talking about now facing a fragmented national space law environment. We have to bring it to a European level and then advertise it internationally.
Thank you so much for that. Nicolas, I saw you agreeing on a lot of the points. Can you provide also your perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody has said one of the points that I wanted to make. So I think there's almost everything covered. I think on the regulatory situation, I have the feeling that there are certain parts where we will have fierce debates, where we'll have diverging interests in a sort of way. One topic could be the question of liabilities, where it's of course way more difficult when it comes to real numbers than to talk about, yes, we need some liabilities. But I think they can be overcome if we keep in mind that we want to become first movers and therefore have a lot of positive impact for all of the actors in the sector. And if we keep that in mind and keep that vision afloat, then I think we'll come to coverage for a lot of points. The same, I think, is true for when it comes to data sharing. But I see here the bigger problem for Europe being building up the technological possibilities. I think this is something where we should figure out how to make sure that we have all the information that we need, because we will not get it, at least at the moment, not from our international partners in the fullest detail. So therefore we need to acquire them ourselves, which is a big project. We should not underestimate. And then still the question, what do we do with this? Whether we find a solution within the European Commission or companies like Okapi Space, Okapi Orbits that use this information, this data to secure the orbits. I think the technical aspect here is a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, I think a huge problem will be the question of who pays for it. And this is in the end the big thing. We all have an interest in a safe environment, while at the same time none of us here have themselves put any well, Airbus did, but has put some debris in orbit. But of course there's a lot of debris there that is not from certain EU member states. Some of them don't even have a space program. There's a lot of it that is coming from outside. So how to involve all of this together when it comes to cleanup, when it comes to avoidance, when it comes to who basically avoids other satellites, I think this will be more difficult. And I think the most difficult discussion, because it will become an international discussion in which we can lead and must lead, but still it will be a difficult one. When it comes to cleanup and who pays for what, as soon as it's about money, I think it will be a little bit more difficult.
Thank you so much for that. Just wanted to note for everyone listening to ask questions on the chat. We'll try to answer them in a second. From my end, I wanted to ask everyone one last question. One common question for you, Christoph and Nicolas, is something that we have been talking about since the beginning, international aspects, especially convergence. We know that some other countries have already started to legislate this as well. On top of that, we need, as has been highlighted throughout this debate, space is a common area for all of humanity. So the EU wants to become the world leader on setting standards and regulations for the space law, as it has done with a number of other areas, from the GDPR to cybersecurity. How do we structure cooperation with like-minded countries and with those countries that might not be as like-minded as the EU? Christoph, can I start with you? You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry. So how do we structure cooperation with third countries? So first of all, we have a structured way of cooperating in space with certain countries. So we have so-called space dialogues in place, for example, with the US, with Canada, with Japan. And with these, we had only recently, in fact, with these three countries, space dialogues, and the issue of STM and space sustainability, we discuss it with them, and I think we all agree there that it's not a quarter to midnight, but sort of 1 minute to midnight to act. And I think there is absolute understanding on this. Now, of course, understanding a problem does not mean that we all go in the same direction in solving the problem. Having said that, I would say I'm, from a personal point of view, quite encouraged by what the US is doing, in the sense that they have now made a proposal to stakeholders for a new SST-like system, which they call tracks, which is very similar to what we do in Europe. So basically, the idea is to have a basic SST service, which is offered by the public authorities, and then private companies can add on top of that their own services, high-end services that they want to offer. Now, of course, where it becomes a little bit more tricky and more complex is with perhaps countries which are not so friendly to the EU, and we have to see a little bit. But let's say, definitely, of course, we have a problem with Russia. I mean, I think that's absolutely clear. And I mean, unfortunately, this conflict with Russia is going in let's say directions which perhaps you would have never imagined. So in the UN COPIUS, they are trying to set up an expert group on dark and quiet skies, for example, and guess who was against setting up such an expert group? Russia and Iran. So of course there are some countries where it's very difficult and at the moment impossible to work with, but perhaps with time this can be overcome. But I will not hide from you that with some countries it's impossible to work together at the moment.
Thank you for that very honest opinion. And when we're talking about such important matters, we have to consider very honest opinions. Nicolas, if I can ask you the same question, where is the room for international collaboration with global partners? And maybe there's room for a multilateral approach on this.
Well, I mean, Christoph has described the big problem that we have at the moment, especially with the situation in Russia. I think that also with China, we never had the best relations in this matter. So I think we still have to overcome some barriers here. Yet at the same time, I have the hope, the optimism that people see that, I mean, we're all in the same boat. It's a little bit like climate change. If we don't act together, then we will all just fail. And this is not really an option for any one of us. So therefore, there is the necessity to work together. However, of course, and that's also why I think it's so important that this initiative comes from Europe and that it is very concise, that it's very comprehensive, because anything that because we can have this middle ground position. If anything comes from the US, everybody else knows we're not going to do that. No matter what they say, you know, this is a red line for Russia and China. Definitely for us, if we present something, I think it's much easier for others to join. And I want to bring in another point. We have member states in the EU that don't even have an own space program. We have very small member states up to very big member states. We have very strong ones and some with a very small economy, with not so much industry, with no space industry. And yet, if we can bring together these different views, all of them have an interest in space that differs whether you have an industry or not, but they still have an interest. And may it just be to look at the dark and quiet sky. If you bring all of them together, and if we can succeed in this and have a comprehensive space law that is applicable for all of the EU, then I'm very certain that we have a foundation for discussions in which a lot of other countries can join in. And it's not just the big space nations that should have a say about the future of space, but it is really also a question of everybody else who can and will become in the future also a spacefaring nation. Or is already underway to do that right now. So I'm thinking about Brazil, South Africa, and others who are already on their way, but also those member states of the UN that don't have a space program right now. And if we can bring all of this together, then I think, then we already have a certain wave movement that will topple those space leaders to at least sit down and discuss. And this is a little bit the strategy that I see ahead, the necessity and the proposal for a discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I want to, from my end, one last question to our industry members. Particularly the joint communication last year on the EU approach to space traffic management rightly emphasized the important aspect of having industry contribute to the space traffic management in general and making sure that any regulatory framework in the future will be based on industry contribution. It noted that there should be a forum, let's say industry group that can provide its contributions to the work of the Commission and member states. Bertrand, I wanted to ask you, what else or how else can industry make sure that its contributions are part of the upcoming EU space law?
As mentioned, there are already some existing forums where these issues are discussed, in particular, of course, the EU SST partnership we are part of. So this is for us useful roundtable where we can express our views. There is also now something which is more addressing SMEs or startups, which is called the EU ISF, if I'm not wrong, where also there is an opportunity for industry to dialogue with the Commission, at least on these matters. So I think the dialogue is open. It's more about now trying to converge on some practicable provisions, and this is where, of course, the pen is in the hands of the Commission. There again, as I said in my introduction, we would welcome having an harmonized EU space law, but at the same time, we are very concerned that this EU space law would be at the right level, at a reasonable level of regulation, not outplaying the need for regulation and increasing the burden of regulation on industry, just providing just what is good. And our personal, our Airbus analysis of the current situation is that among the 11 existing national space laws, in addition to the fact that they are not totally harmonized, there is also the concern that some of them are very strict. I don't want to designate any of them, but some are very accurate, strict and precise. Some others are more flexible and so on. So there is a balance to be found between the two, to have something which is appropriate, which provides the right level, but not too much, to put it that way.
Thank you so much. And Christina, I'd like to ask you the same question, particularly because you're a new space actor, you want to make new space safe. How do we make sure that the EU takes into account the rising European startups and SMEs that are trying to transform the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think one of the opportunities is participating in events like the ESA Space Debris Mitigation Workshop, kind of these events to show our expertise, because we're acting in the market, talking to operators who are one of the angle point for how can we be sustainable and what do we have to do. We can share expertise there, and also showing as a whole industry what innovation or technology we can use to support our leading position as the European Union, and see that we bring also not only legislation to the international negotiations table, but also technology to solve these upcoming challenges, and to show a way how it's possible, also in an economical, efficient way for all the actors, because I think that's a crucial point. Sustainability is important, but we also have to face that all the operators in space, they have a business case why they're operating space assets. And we also have to make sure that they have a good optimal maneuver plan, and they also get an economic benefit to provide a service in the end internationally, which is competitive, appealing. So I think that's a really important point where the whole industry can play a role in being in a dialogue with the legislation parties, and show the technology and also share the views.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. From my questions, that's it. I am now turning into the chat to see for some of our participants' questions. One of the first questions is for Mr. Kautz, but I think it can be a wider question because it is important. I remember, Christoph, you mentioned during last year's European Space Forum, actually, this issue. So there's member states' competencies. You mentioned rightly that there's 11 different jurisdictions or member states that already have their own legislative framework on space. How does the EU, so both the Commission and the Parliament represented here today, deal with that issue of the treaties of competences? And how do we make sure that there's a harmonized EU space law at the same time that doesn't affect member states' rights or ability to enact their own space legislation? You're on mute.
Sorry, yes. So it relates to this question, how can you harmonize when the EU treaty tells you in Article 189 that in the space area you cannot harmonize? Okay, so first of all, one has to say that it's not that you cannot harmonize in the space sector, meaning that, for example, you have, of course, legislation on waste, on chemicals, which applies to the space sector, despite Article 189. So what we are saying here is that we are looking at the internal market. And for the internal market, you have Article 114 of the treaty, which allows you to harmonize. So the focus of our proposed legislation should be on the internal market. And there exists an interesting parallel. So in the area of health, also the EU cannot harmonize. Nevertheless, there exists a directive harmonizing tobacco advertising, because the focus of this piece of legislation is on the internal market, Article 114. This is how you basically square the circle, if I may say it like that. But more seriously, of course, we have to look into what can we really harmonize and what will be left to the member states.
Yeah, I fully agreed, and a very difficult situation for the Commission. We're hoping that the public consultation and impact assessment will shed some light on further thinking, whether a regulation, whether a directive, and so on. I wanted to ask any of our other panelists whether they had any thoughts on this important matter of competencies. If not, I'm more than happy to go to the next question. And this has already been mentioned by you, Niklas, particularly around costs and who will pay for this. One of the questions has been who should be responsible to bear the financial weight for STM, whether it should be operators, states, regulators, or let's say the EU as an international or multinational organization. Niklas, I wanted to turn to you first because I know you had already pondered on that, whether you had any thoughts.
Should I start?
Yes.
For the cost, I think that those so one step back. So if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, there is defined that every action in space, because of the common the Outer Space Treaty doesn't define it as a common heritage of mankind, but it goes in vaguely in this direction. And so every endeavor in space needs to be in the benefit of all nations. That's the wording there. I think we can work with that. So it means that we always need to create a value over the value for the person that is doing the endeavor for themselves. This can mean a lot. One example can be, for example, Copernicus and Galileo, which are great programs that we as Europe do. And at the same time, we're giving the data away to everybody. So we are not having the benefits only to ourselves, but we're sharing with everybody else. Now, I think for the future, when we see more and more private entities who also want to exclude others from data or from the services, which is their good right, then we need to see that they also contribute something for the benefit of all mankind. And this something I think could be a certain space tax that we use to invest, first of all, to clean up space, second of all, to avoid collision. But then we can even think further and go on with building up space infrastructure that we need in the future. If we would have refueling in space, it would be so much easier for all industries to benefit from this. And this tax, however, tax always a bad word for companies, I know, but we also have to face the fact that at the moment space travel is very, very expensive, very difficult, very risk aware. So maybe we can find a way that this tax is only slowly increasing. So that in the beginning you get a huge discount because you're first movers and we want you to do something. You're the ones trying to figure out how it's working, but yet still we have problems to solve, and this could be with a minimal tax. Only if the risks are getting lower, the investments are getting low and everything, that we can say, you know what, you're taking now a big profit and therefore you need to also reinvest something or bring something back to mankind in some form or way. And this, I think, makes some sense when it comes to the idea on how we treat space in general, but also would help us solve the issue when it comes to clean space. However, I mean, there are also alternatives. We can also think about everybody needs to have their own plan on how to reduce the trash. And if you have a private entity that you have a contract with and say, you know, they are getting money from me so that they remove it at the end, or they do something with it and they take the security aspect from, and it works, then I'm fine. But there we need to really figure out if it works, because every company that says we want to solve the issue first have to prove that they can solve the issue. This is also very important, I think, and we cannot sit up. The society sit at the expenses of individual ones. But in general, I think this is up for discussion. But in the end, it is on the interest of all of the sector that this. I think Christoph and I have the same thing, even though we're not even in the same town. But that the question of sustainability and security, as well as the questions of future infrastructure, is beneficial for the whole sector. So why not invest in it together, like we do with roads, with a lot of other stuff here on the Earth?
Thank you so much for that, Niklas. Definitely a lot of interesting ideas there. Bertrand, I wanted to turn to you. We heard space tax So I wanted to see whether you had any reactions to that, especially since you mentioned during your introduction to not have for the EU space law to not have any big financial impositions.
As Niklas said, as a company, we don't like very much to be taxed. We already pay in a certain way space taxes because we have always the insurance layer in the cost of our programs. But anyway, it's not for us to decide on this kind of things, and the funding of this challenge of STM is in the hands of political authorities, whether in Brussels or in the national capitals. I don't want to make a specific point on that. I just would like to share with you a last thought, if you allow me, Alexander, which I thought interesting, which is because some try to introduce the idea that STM is also about strategic autonomy, the capacity to be able to monitor, to know about what is happening in space, and to be able to counter threats or to protect our assets. And that, I think this is perfectly right to say this is a strategic autonomy dimension. But what is interesting is that for years, when you spoke about strategic autonomy in space, it was about providing from space capabilities which will provide autonomy and strategy, namely Earth observation or SATCOM or even intelligence from the space to Earth. And now we are entering in a kind of reverse or at least rebalanced shift where it's incoming to be more, or of course, the Earth observation SATCOM will remain, but now there is a further dimension which is from Earth to space, the capacity to monitor from the Earth the risks and the threats and the monitoring of the situation in space. So I think it's important in the thinking of people who are trying to plan and to anticipate the evolution of the space technological activities to have this mindset reverse in mind.
Thank you so much for that. Definitely, again, very important points raised there. Mindful of time, I want to just maybe ask for some closing remarks, particularly about, in 2 or 3 words, how important is the upcoming EU space law for everyone? Christina, may I please start with you? You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I think this will be a tipping point where we can decide where we go as European Union and how our industry is going to evolve, especially in regards to being competitive internationally.
Niklas, can I turn to you?
The EU space law is the most important piece of legislation for the sector and has the potential to set international standards.
Thank you. Bertrand?
I think I cannot say more than Niklas and Christina. I would just urge that the proposal, once tabled by the Commission, will be discussed in a constructive spirit by member states and especially by those who have already their national law and which will be, of course, inclined to defend their national laws towards the EU one. So I hope that a compromise will be found in that negotiation.
Perfect, thank you. And Christoph, last but not least.
Well, let's say you don't have to convince me about the importance of the space law. But more seriously, I mean, personal view, I think we should definitely be as the ones leading by example and the standard setters in this domain.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of our speakers for a very, I think, fruitful and critical debate in this time. From my end, a personal gratitude and thank you for speakers as well as for everyone attending, because it just shows we had almost 200 registrants for this, so it shows how important this debate is for everyone in Brussels and in the EU, and as has been outlined globally. If you would like to see further materials on this and further debates, please make sure to subscribe to our channels and our mailing list, and we will be definitely talking about the EU space law and space traffic management going forward. Thank you again for your panelists, and hope everyone has a good day and it's not too hot for wherever everyone is. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.